Everyone mocked Obese girl, bidding on lame horse. Mountain Man's discovery shocked the auction. The spring sun blazed over Fort Gibson, Oklahoma Territory, in May of 1823. Dust swirled through the wooden stockade where over 200 settlers, traders, and frontiersmen had gathered for the quarterly horse auction. Sarah Brennan stood at the back of the crowd, her calloused hands clutching a small leather pouch containing every penny she'd saved over 5 grueling years working in the fort stables. At 23, Sarah had spent more of her life with horses than people. Her parents had died of fever when she was 12, leaving her to survive on whatever work she could find. The stablemaster, a gruff German immigrant named Klaus, had taken pity on the orphaned girl and given her a job mucking stalls. Over the years, her body had grown strong and broad from the labor, her frame carrying the weight that came from eating whatever scraps the fort's kitchen would spare her, usually leftover biscuits soaked in bacon grease and beans that had sat too long. The other women whispered about her. Sarah had heard the words hefty, stout, and less charitable terms muttered behind gloved hands. But horses never cared about her appearance. They responded to her gentle touch, her patient voice, her instinct for their ailments and moods. "Next lot," bellowed the auctioneer, a red-faced man named Cyrus Webb. "One gelding, gray coat, approximately 12 years old, previously owned by the Perkins family, headed back east." A murmur rippled through the crowd as a stable hand led out a dappled gray horse. The animal moved with a pronounced limp, its left front leg barely touching the ground with each painful step. Several men laughed outright. "Look at that sorry creature. Peh, ain't worth the bullet to put it down." Sarah's heart clenched. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the annoyed grunts as her broad shoulders moved past trappers in buckskin and soldiers in dusty blue uniforms. She needed to see that horse. The gelding stood 16 hands high, with a noble head and intelligent dark eyes that surveyed the jeering crowd with what Sarah could only describe as dignified resignation. Beneath the dust and neglect, she could see the ghost of a magnificent animal. The conformation was excellent: strong hindquarters, deep chest, elegant neck. But that leg... "Who'll start the bidding?" Cyrus called out. $1, 50 cents. Silence, then cruel laughter. "I'll give you 2 bits to haul it to the knacker," shouted a barrel-chested trapper. "Starting bid is $1, Cyrus repeated, irritation creeping into his voice. "This is a sound horse except for a minor injury. Good for light work, breeding maybe." "Breeding?" another voice rang out. Another. "Only thing that nag could breed is more lame horses." Sarah studied the gelding's leg carefully. The limp seemed localized to the hoof rather than higher up the leg. No heat, no swelling in the fetlock or pastern that she could see from 10 feet away. Something wasn't right about this. $1! Sarah's voice cut through the mockery. Heads turned. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, heard the shift from derision of the horse to derision of her. "Well, well," drawled a voice she recognized, Tom Hutchins, the blacksmith's son, who'd made sport of her for years. "The fat girl wants the crippled horse. Ain't that fitting?" Laughter erupted. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed on the gray gelding. Its ears had pricked forward at her voice. $2, she said louder. "Lord have mercy," a woman's voice tittered. "She's serious." "Going once at $2, Cyrus said, clearly eager to move on. $3. Sarah opened her pouch and held up the coins, letting them catch the sunlight. The laughter died down, replaced by puzzled muttering. $3 was real money, a week's wages for a skilled laborer. For a lame horse, it was madness. $3 going once, going twice. $5! Every head swiveled toward the new bidder. Sarah's stomach dropped. A tall man in buckskins stepped forward from the crowd. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the wilderness, deep creases around piercing blue eyes, a thick beard shot through with gray. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who feared neither man nor beast. $5 for the gray, he repeated. Sarah recognized him, Amos Mackenzie, a legendary mountain man who occasionally passed through Fort Gibson. He'd been with the famous Lewis and Clark expedition 20 years prior, or so the stories went. Now he made his living as a horse trader and guide, with a reputation for being able to read animals like some men read books. "Why would you?" Sarah started, but her voice caught. Amos's eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the gray gelding with an intensity that made Sarah's pulse quicken. He'd seen something. Something about this horse. $6, Sarah said, her voice shaking. It was every cent she had. The crowd had gone silent now. This was no longer a comedy. This was a genuine bidding war over what everyone had assumed was worthless livestock. Amos turned to look at her for the first time. His weathered face was unreadable, but something flickered in those blue eyes. Respect? Curiosity? $6.50, he said quietly. Sarah's throat tightened. She had nothing left. The pouch was empty. 5 years of saving, of eating scraps, of denying herself even a new dress or a hair ribbon, and it wasn't enough. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people. "Sold!" Cyrus brought down his gavel. "To Amos Mackenzie for $6.50. Sarah fled before the next lot was called. She pushed through the dispersing crowd, ignoring Tom Hutchins's parting shot about the fat girl's broken heart for a broken horse. By the time she reached the stables, tears were streaming down her face. She threw herself into her work, attacking the stalls with unusual ferocity. Klaus took one look at her red eyes and wisely said nothing, leaving her to her misery. An hour later, she was forking fresh hay into the last stall when a shadow fell across the stable door. "You've got a good eye." Sarah spun around. Amos Mackenzie stood in the doorway, leading Old Gray, as she'd already named him in her mind, by a simple rope halter. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, turning back to her work. "That gelding there," Amos continued as if she hadn't spoken. "You saw something the others missed. Doesn't matter what I saw. He's yours now." "What did you see?" Sarah stabbed the pitchfork into the hay pile. "Why do you care?" "Because I saw the same thing," Amos said, "and I'm wondering if you know what it means." Despite herself, Sarah turned. "The limp is in the hoof, not higher up. No inflammation in the joints. The horse puts weight on it every few steps, which means it's not a break or a tear. Most likely something lodged in the frog or a stone bruise." Amos's weathered face split into a grin. "You've been working horses a long time." "Since I was 12. "Show me." He led Old Gray into the stable. Sarah hesitated, then set down her pitchfork and approached cautiously. The gelding's ears swiveled toward her, and he nickered softly. "Hey, boy," she murmured, running her hand down his neck. The horse leaned into her touch. She moved to the injured leg, running her hands down the cannon bone, over the fetlock, checking for heat or swelling. Nothing. The horse lifted the hoof willingly when she asked. "Hoof pick," she said. Amos handed her one from his belt. Sarah worked carefully, cleaning the packed mud and manure from the frog. And there, wedged deep in the cleft, was a sharp stone, its edges cutting into the sensitive tissue. "Son of a gun!" Amos breathed. Sarah worked the stone loose with gentle persistence. It took 5 minutes of careful maneuvering, but finally the shard of granite came free. Fresh blood welled up from where it had been embedded. "He'll need this cleaned and packed," Sarah said, her professional instincts taking over. "Yarrow and honey to prevent infection, then a poultice of—" "You do it," Amos interrupted. Sarah looked up at him, confused. "He's your horse. For now." The mountain man's eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read. "But I have a feeling he won't be mine for long." Over the next 3 days, Sarah treated Old Gray's injury under Amos's watchful eye. She cleaned the wound with warm salt water, applied poultices of herbs and clay, and wrapped the hoof carefully. The gelding was patient and trusting, standing quietly for her ministrations. On the 4th day, Amos led the horse into the exercise yard. Sarah watched from the stable door, her heart in her throat. Old Gray walked without a limp. "My God," Klaus said from behind her, "the girl worked a miracle." "No miracle," Sarah said quietly. "Just proper care." Amos put the gelding through his paces, walk, trot, canter. The horse moved like a dream, powerful and smooth. Several people had gathered to watch, drawn by word of the crippled horse's transformation. "I'll be damned," Tom Hutchins said. "That nag can actually move." "That nag is worth $50 if he's worth a penny," Amos announced loudly. "Sound legs, good wind, excellent conformation. Miss Brennan here saw what the rest of you were too blind to see." Sarah felt her cheeks redden, but this time not from shame. "I'm offering you a partnership," Amos said, turning to face her directly. "I've got connections with the Army, with wagon trains heading west. They need horses, good horses. But I need someone who can evaluate them, who can spot potential under neglect or injury." "I'm a stable hand," Sarah stammered. "You're a horse healer," Amos corrected. "And you've got better instincts than men who've been trading horses for 20 years. 30% share of profits. What do you say?" Sarah looked at Old Gray, at the horse that everyone had mocked, that she'd recognized had value. She thought about 5 more years mucking stalls, about the whispers and the laughter, about living small because she was afraid to reach for something bigger. 50%, she heard herself say. "I do half the work. I get half the profits." Amos's eyes widened, then he threw back his head and laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. "You've got spine, girl. 40% and I'll teach you everything I know about horse trading. 45 and you've got a deal." He extended his weathered hand. "Partner." Sarah shook it firmly, sealing the agreement that would change both their lives. The partnership started small. Amos had connections, but Sarah had the gift. At every auction, every farm sale, every Army surplus lot, she could spot the diamonds in the rough, the horses other buyers passed over. A mare with rein rot that cleared up with proper treatment, a stallion with thrush in both front hooves that became sound within 2 weeks. A young gelding that everyone assumed was vicious but was simply scared, responding beautifully to patient handling. They developed a system. Amos negotiated the purchases and sales while Sarah rehabilitated the animals. He taught her about bloodlines and breeding, about reading buyers and knowing when to walk away from a deal. She taught him massage techniques and herbal remedies she'd learned through years of trial and error. Their first major sale came 3 months into the partnership, 20 horses to an Army cavalry unit heading to new posts in Arkansas Territory. The commanding officer, a captain named James Morrison, was initially skeptical. "These horses were all purchased as unsuitable for service," he said, reviewing Amos's bill of sale. "They were unsuitable," Amos agreed, "until Miss Brennan got her hands on them." Captain Morrison examined each horse personally, checking legs, teeth, wind, and temperament. Finally, he turned to Sarah, who'd been standing quietly to the side. "You did this work?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Remarkable. I've been with the cavalry for 15 years, and these are some of the finest mounts I've seen." He counted out the payment, $400 in gold and silver. "I'll be recommending your services to my fellow officers." Word spread quickly. Within 6 months, Sarah and Amos were the most sought-after horse traders in the territory. The same people who'd mocked Sarah at that first auction now lined up for her services, though some couldn't quite hide their residual disdain. "Still can't believe a fat girl knows more about horses than my stableman," one wealthy merchant muttered within Sarah's hearing. Amos, who'd been reviewing a contract nearby, set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "Sir, Miss Brennan has forgotten more about horses than most men will ever learn. If her expertise is somehow diminished in your eyes by her appearance, I suggest you take your business elsewhere. We have clients waiting." The merchant sputtered an apology and quickly signed the contract. That night, as they reviewed their accounts in the small office they'd rented, Sarah worked up the courage to address what had been weighing on her mind. "Amos, You don't have to defend me. I'm used to the comments. The mountain man set down his ledger and fixed her with those penetrating blue eyes. Maybe you're used to it, but I'm not. You're the best partner I've ever had, and I'll be damned if I let ignorant fools disrespect you in my presence. Something shifted in Sarah's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove heating their office. Their success attracted attention, not all of it welcome. Marcus Griggs, a ruthless horse trader who dominated the market before their arrival, began spreading rumors. Sarah was a witch who cursed other people's horses to drive up her business. Amos was a fraud who bought stolen livestock and forged papers. The whispers might have remained harmless gossip, except Griggs had connections with local officials. One morning, the territorial marshal arrived at their stables with a warrant. Marcus Griggs has filed a complaint, Marshal Tate said apologetically. He'd bought a horse from them himself and knew the accusations were baseless. Says you sold the army horses that belonged to him. I have to investigate. The next week was a nightmare. Every transaction was scrutinized, every bill of sale examined. Griggs produced witnesses who claimed to have seen Amos buying stolen horses in the dead of night. Sarah was called before a magistrate to explain her unnatural abilities with animals. How does a simple stable girl possess knowledge that exceeds trained farriers and veterinarians? The magistrate demanded. By paying attention, sir, Sarah replied, and by caring more about the horses than about what people think of me. Captain Morrison arrived from Fort Smith just as the magistrate was preparing his verdict. He brought with him detailed records of every horse he'd purchased, testimonials from cavalry officers throughout the territory, and a letter from the territorial governor praising Sarah and Amos's contributions to military readiness. These accusations are not just baseless, Morrison declared. They're an attempt by Marcus Griggs to eliminate honest competition. I've done some investigating of my own. Griggs has been selling unsound horses to the army for years, coating lame animals with numbing agents to hide their infirmities. I have 3 witnesses prepared to testify. The case against Sarah and Amos collapsed. The magistrate not only dismissed all charges but opened an investigation into Griggs, who fled the territory before he could be arrested. The ordeal should have been a victory, but Sarah found herself shaking when it was over. They'd come so close to losing everything, not just their business, but their reputations, their freedom. That evening, Amos found her in Old Gray's stall. The gelding had become her refuge, the one constant in a world that kept trying to tear her down. You all right? Amos asked quietly. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I thought if we were good at what we do, if we were honest and worked hard, that would be enough. But it's not, is it? People will always find reasons to tear you down. Amos entered the stall and stood beside her. In the dim lamplight, his weathered face looked older, wearier. 23 years ago, I was part of the Corps of Discovery with Lewis and Clark, he said. We mapped territories no white man had ever seen, forded rivers, crossed mountains that touched the sky. And you know what I remember most? Not the grand vistas or the danger. I remember the small moments, the nights around the campfire with people who'd become like family, the satisfaction of a job well done, the feeling that what we were doing mattered. He turned to face her. Sarah, this partnership, it's the first time since that expedition that I've felt that way again, like what I'm doing matters. And it's not just about the horses, it's about working with someone who sees the world the way I do, who looks past the surface to what's real underneath. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Amos, I know I'm 20 years older than you, he continued. I know I'm just a rough mountain man with more scars than sense. But somewhere along the way, you became more than a business partner to me. In the stall's shadows, Sarah saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection, the hope that perhaps she felt the same way. I fell in love with you the day you bid $3 on a lame horse, Amos said, when you stood up to that crowd and refused to back down, when you saw value where everyone else saw waste. Sarah felt tears welling up, but these weren't tears of shame or frustration. "I don't care about the age difference," she whispered, "and you're not just a rough mountain man. You're the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth something beyond my labor." "You're worth everything," Amos said roughly. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Every damn thing, Sarah Brennan." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative. Two people who'd spent their lives being tough, learning to be tender. Old Gray nickered softly, as if offering his blessing. Their romance became the talk of Fort Gibson, though this time the gossip was more curious than cruel. Sarah Brennan and Amos Mackenzie, the unlikely pair who'd built an empire from one lame horse, were courting. Amos proved to be a surprisingly romantic suitor. He brought Sarah wildflowers from the prairie, taught her to shoot and track, took her on long rides through the territory where they could escape the crowds and simply be together. Sarah, in turn, showed him the subtle beauty and stillness, the peace of grooming horses at sunset, the satisfaction of nursing a sick foal back to health, the simple pleasure of a shared meal at the end of a long day. A year after their partnership began, Amos asked Sarah to marry him. He did it in the meadow where they'd rehabilitated dozens of horses, with Old Gray standing witness. "I don't have much to offer," he said, kneeling in the grass. "No fancy house, no high society connections. Just a business we built together, a few hundred acres of good grassland, and a heart that's completely yours." "That's everything I want," Sarah replied, pulling him to his feet. "Everything I've ever wanted." They married in the spring of 1825, 2 years after that fateful auction. The ceremony was simple, held outdoors with Klaus giving Sarah away and Captain Morrison standing as Amos's best man. Old Gray, now fully recovered and magnificent in his prime, wore ribbons braided into his mane and led the small procession. Even Tom Hutchins attended, though he had the grace to look sheepish when he congratulated the bride. "I was a fool," he admitted. "I judged you by your outside and missed everything that mattered." "We all make mistakes," Sarah said graciously. "The trick is learning from them." The partnership flourished into an empire. Sarah and Amos expanded their operation, purchasing land and building proper facilities for horse rehabilitation and training. They developed a reputation that reached far beyond Oklahoma territory. From Texas to Missouri, from Arkansas to Kansas, people spoke of the Mackenzie Ranch where miracles happened. Sarah pioneered techniques that wouldn't be common practice for decades: hydrotherapy for injured legs, specialized diets for different ailments, systematic training methods that emphasized patience over force. Amos used his frontier connections to establish breeding programs, importing quality stock, and carefully tracking bloodlines. 3 years into their marriage, Sarah gave birth to twin daughters, Mary and Grace, both healthy and loud. Amos, who'd never imagined himself a father, proved to be surprisingly adept with babies. Sarah would often find him in the nursery at midnight, holding both girls and singing old frontier ballads in his gravelly voice. "Who would have thought?" he'd say, marveling at the tiny hands gripping his calloused fingers. "An old mountain man with daughters." "They're lucky to have you," Sarah would reply. The girls grew up on horseback, learning from both parents. Mary inherited her mother's intuitive understanding of horses, while Grace showed her father's head for business. By the time they were teenagers, both were accomplished riders and trainers in their own right. Old Gray lived to the remarkable age of 28, spending his final years as the beloved patriarch of the ranch. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, Amos and Sarah buried him on the hill overlooking their meadow with a marker that read, "Old Gray, the horse that started it all." In the summer of 1843, 20 years after that first auction, Sarah and Amos attended the Fort Gibson quarterly sale one last time. They were in their 60s now, successful beyond their wildest dreams. Their daughters had taken over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, leaving them free to simply enjoy their golden years. The auction was much larger than Sarah remembered. Hundreds of horses, buyers from 3 territories, sophisticated protocols. But the basic rhythm remained the same. The auctioneer's chant, the smell of dust and horse sweat, the electric energy of commerce. "Next lot," the current auctioneer called. "One mare, bay coat, approximately 10 years old. Minor injury to the right hind leg." The mare limped into view, and Sarah felt her heart clench with familiar recognition. She glanced at Amos and saw the same awareness in his eyes. "Shall we?" he asked with a grin. "For old time's sake," Sarah agreed. They bid on the mare, not aggressively, just enough to secure her at a fair price. As they led their purchase away, a young girl approached them. She was heavy-set with hopeful eyes, clearly a stable hand based on her work-worn clothes. "Excuse me," the girl said shyly. "Are you really Sarah Mackenzie, the horse healer?" "I am," Sarah confirmed. "I've heard stories about you," the girl continued, "about how you started with nothing, how you saved a lame horse and built an empire, how you proved everyone wrong." Sarah studied the girl's face and saw herself 20 years ago, hungry for something more, desperate to prove her worth. "What's your name?" she asked. "Emma, ma'am. Emma Collins." "Tell me, Emma, do you have a good eye for horses?" The girl nodded eagerly. "I think so, ma'am. I work in the stables and—" "This mare here," Sarah interrupted, gesturing to their purchase. "What do you see?" Emma approached cautiously and examined the horse with surprising thoroughness. "The limp is in the hock, not the hoof. No swelling, no heat. Probably just a strain from being penned in a small space too long. Rest and some liniment, she'll be good as new." Sarah and Amos exchanged a look. "How would you like a job?" Amos asked. "We need someone at the ranch to help train the new horses, someone with potential." Emma's eyes went wide. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Sarah said. "Everyone deserves a chance to prove what they're capable of, regardless of what others see when they look at them." As they rode back to the ranch with Emma following on a borrowed horse, Sarah leaned against Amos in the saddle. The mare with the injured leg kept pace easily, her limp already improving. "Think she'll work out?" Amos asked. "I know she will," Sarah replied. "She reminds me of someone I used to know, someone who bid her last $3 on a lame horse and changed her whole life." Amos chuckled and wrapped his arm around her waist. "Best $3 anyone ever spent." "$6.50, Sarah corrected. "You outbid me, remember?" "Best $6.50 then." They rode home through the golden afternoon light, toward the ranch they'd built from nothing, toward their daughters and grandchildren, toward the legacy of giving chances to the overlooked and underestimated. Behind them, Emma followed on her borrowed mount, her eyes bright with possibility. Ahead of her lay years of hard work, of proving herself, of building something from determination and skill. But she wouldn't walk that path alone. She'd have mentors who understood, who'd walked the same road and knew that true value lies not in appearance, but in heart, in skill, in the courage to see what others miss. The story of Sarah and Amos Mackenzie would be told for generations, not as a fairy tale, but as a testament to the truth that in the Wild West, success belonged to those bold enough to claim it, regardless of what the crowd believed. And it all started with one girl, one lame horse, and the courage to bid when everyone else laughed.